And again, I'm still trying integrity stuff. Now, when I was a kid, I went through all these different science phases. How I ended up in philosophy is a long story. But, I had my amateur rockhound geology phase, my astronomy phase, and my chemistry phase when my parents were lucky I didn't burn down a house. But at any rate, and during my chemistry phase, I had a really cheap old chemistry balance like this where you put some weights in one part and then you balance it out with what you wanted to weigh. And you probably had these in chemistry lab in high school and middle school. But the reason it's on the utilitarianism PowerPoint is that it furnishes a good metaphor for what this moral theory tries to recommend as basically a decision procedure for figuring out what to do. And that's that we should basically weigh consequences. And on balance, choose the side with the best consequences. And because of that aspect, utilitarianism fits into a broad category of ethical theories called consequentialist moral theories. Now, one that we're not really going to look at is called ethical egoism. But the one we are going to look at is utilitarianism, and they both fit into this consequentialist mold. Moral theories, consequentialist moral theories, basically hold that the only thing morally relevant to our figuring out what to do are the results of our actions, the future results of our actions. So consequences are the only thing that matter. So consequentialism holds that only consequences are relevant. When I say to the moral quality of an action, that's to whether an action is morally right or wrong, good or bad. And this was not done haphazardly. When I made up this little diagram, this slide, I meant this to suggest something about consequences that's important for these theories. But think about it. Where are the consequences of our actions located? Past, present, and future. In the future, right? We do what we do, and then there are future results, good or bad, from what we do. Right? And so, a point of view that focuses only on consequences essentially makes the past irrelevant. The only thing that matters are future results. And this becomes, for some people, a criticism of this type of ethics. Well, now, again, we're not going to look at egoism, but it differs from utilitarianism in how it answers the question, consequences for whom. In other words, if the right thing to do is to choose that course of action that promotes the best consequences, it naturally raises the question of consequences for whom. And for egoism, let me get a roll. The only consequences that matter are the consequences for the doer of the action. So I kind of try to indicate that here by saying if this is the person who's making a moral choice, doing the action, then the only thing that matters are the results, good or bad, for the doer of the action. How it is that what you do affects others, whether it be good or bad, is morally irrelevant from the standpoint of egoism. Now that's one of the things that has made this theory a controversial moral theory, because very often the best consequences for me might not be the best consequences for you. I mean, we just had tax season, right? One of my backgammon players is a professional accountant. And, she does other people's taxes. And people trust her with their information. She needs to be taking her client's interest into account. But a theory that says the only thing that matters are the consequences for me, the consequences for you don't matter morally, makes it such that you can't trust an egoist to always act for your own benefit, in your own interest. They're acting primarily in their interest. So a lot of philosophers don't advocate egoism. Utilitarianism basically is a lot more attractive to people because it says the consequences that matter are the consequences for everyone affected by what I do, for everyone affected by my actions. So that would include the person making the moral choice, but also other people. And if you're using utilitarian reasoning to make a big policy decision, like whether or not to build a project like the Baku Dam, or whether or not to implement universal health care or something like that, the consequences that matter are consequences for society as a whole of a given policy. Well, when we looked at Descartes, we saw that he was really enamored with geometry and with trying to get out a system of thought that was based on principles that were as certain as geometric axioms, and then had that sort of foundational quality that everything else in his philosophy would follow from that. Well, for the original utilitarians, Bentham and Mill, and Bentham says as much, the single principle on which their whole moral theory is built, what's called the principle of utility, functions, or is supposed to function something like an axiom, be kind of the one big truth that the whole theory is based on. And that makes it a sort of deceptively simple and invitingly simple moral theory. Now, these are paraphrases of Bentham's very flowery original statement of the principle. Always act so as to bring about the greatest net good for all those affected by your actions. Again, these pages refer to other texts that I use when I'm doing this. Always act for the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or to promote the greatest good for the greatest number. That is the classic way a lot of people summarize the principle of utility. And so, if your moral obligation then is to do what promotes the greatest good in terms of consequences, it raises the question of, well, what do we mean by greatest good? What do we mean by good here? And we've also already seen philosophers who wrestled with the idea of good and how to define it, right? We saw Plato thought that moral goodness is not something down here, but it's an absolute eternal standard in the realm of the form, right? It is embodied in the form of the good with a capital G, right? So that's Plato's view. We saw that Aristotle was much more practical, and he talks about moral goodness being based on the promotion of happiness. And Aristotle was not the only ancient philosopher to think that in some sense we ought to define morally good in terms of what brings happiness or pleasure. And the philosophy that this is associated with is hedonism. Now, the original hedonists were kind of egoistic hedonists. What I want to do is adopt a lifestyle and make choices that bring about the most pleasure or happiness for me. What the original utilitarians, Bentham and Mill, did was basically give this ancient view of hedonism a universal twist that made it much more palatable to a sophisticated 19th century audience and even to philosophers today. And what they said is, no, we want to adopt a philosophy that says the thing to do is to make those moral choices that bring about the greatest good on balance for all concerned. And the original utilitarians adopted hedonism as the standard for moral goodness. Again, they thought that pleasure, the absence of pain, happiness is the ultimate standard. It is what we looked at these words before. For them, pleasure is intrinsically good. That is good for its own sake alone. From the standpoint of hedonism, the only standard worth seeking for its own sake is pleasure or happiness. That's the only good that's intrinsically good. All other goods are good, and the word here is instrumentally good. One of the things about ethics, one of the hurdles is the vocabulary. I used to give out a separate vocabulary sheet for ethics when I taught semester-long ethics courses. They did a lot of them at Hartford Community College. And it's just getting a handle on the terminology. But instrumentally good basically is, good because it promotes or brings about pleasure or happiness. but not good for its own sake. So that's the distinction. So Bentham and Mill, and you say, well, why are they doing this? Well, in part, they're trying to see if they can respond to Hume's moral skepticism. David Hume tried to argue that we cannot reason about morality, that moral matters are more a matter of feeling, he said, of sentiment than reason. And in response to that kind of skepticism, the utilitarians tried to establish a way that we could reason about moral right and wrong, and they thought we could do that if we got ethics out of the realm of the supernatural and the otherworldly, and look at ethics as merely a matter of promoting the greatest good in this world in terms of promoting a society with the most happiness and the least amount of pain and unhappiness. And so, so that's what they were about, and they were also about trying to reform the British legal system. Now, so successfully did they do this that the standard theory of punishment, in other words, the philosophical underpinning that tries to provide a moral justification for why society can punish people, is basically a utilitarian moral theory. Set. Reasons like protection of society, rehabilitation of the offender, and the deterrence of future crimes all have to do with consequences and are all utilitarian justifications for punishment. Now utilitarianism has much broader applications than just its application to the justification of punishment. But that's one area. Okay, so I'm just going to go over one or two more slides, and then we're going to go to the test. Okay, so hedonism is the view that only pleasure or happiness, and look, I mean, a lot of ink has been spilled in professional philosophical journals over whether pleasure is the same thing as happiness. And you can make a case that they're not exactly the same thing, but for the purposes of looking at this theory, in the philosophy 101 level, basically we want to look at pleasure and happiness as being like interchangeable. But also, in this slide I say what I just said over there. Any other good is good only insofar as it promotes pleasure or lessens pain, but not for its own sake. Now, I'll look at this next time. Mill tried to prove hedonism, but he actually committed a logical fallacy in doing it. In logic, if you use a word, right, in logic you've got the statements that support the conclusion, and then you've got the conclusion. Well, if you use the same word with two different meanings, one in the premises and another in the conclusion, then you haven't really proved your conclusion because you've changed horses in midstream. In classical logic, this was called the fallacy of four terms, but it's basically a fallacy of ambiguity. And so Mill's proof didn't really work, but we're going to look then a little more closely at Bentham's original version of utilitarianism next time. Okay. Just real quickly, we're not going to dwell on this logical point, but in showing that pleasure is desirable as the end of moral reasoning, what he needs to show is desirable in the sense of meaning too. That it's what we ought to desire as the highest good, the promotion of happiness and pleasure. But what he does to try to establish this is point to the fact that pleasure is the one thing people actually do desire. And he says, well, that this pleasure is desirable can be seen from this. Think about a sound or something that's visible, right? If something is audible, it means we can hear it. If something is desirable, it means that we can and do desire it, and people can and do desire a happy life. But that only shows that pleasure is desirable in the sense that it can be desired, just as a sound that's audible can be heard. But it does not show that pleasure is desirable in this heavier sense that it's what we ought to desire. So Mill, who by the way wrote one of the most popular logic textbooks in the 19th century, makes a Logic 101 error when he's writing his own stuff. Well, Bentham was the person who really started utilitarianism. Mill was his disciple and carried on with the defense of utilitarianism when Bentham got too old to do it. The big word to remember, Bentham started out making utilitarianism a fairly simple system. He said, the only thing we need to worry about when we're trying to measure happiness and pleasure and pain on the other side, the only thing we need to worry about is how much of it there is, right? And so we choose the course of action that has the most happiness or the least amount of pain. And so the word quantity is important here, but he also thinks that these are quantifiable. But Bentham's famous phrase here is that quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin's as good as poetry. Pushpin, from what I've read, is a simple child's game, not that different from pickup sticks. So what is he saying? He's saying, well, as long as you're getting the same amount of pleasure from it or happiness, it doesn't matter what you're doing. They all have the same value, and this gets him in trouble later, as we'll see when we look at Mill. But the other thing Bentham thought we could actually do is measure in an objective way pleasures and pain. I mean, we can. I had been working on your essay this afternoon, and it was kind of cool in there, and I was pleasantly surprised to find out how much it had warmed up since noon. We can measure temperature, right? And how is it that we can quantitatively talk about that? It's because we have a countable unit, whether it be degrees Fahrenheit, degrees Celsius, whatever. We can measure how hot it is in here, right? And he thought we could compare pleasures and pains in this quantitative way. And, this is not the kind of stuff we could make up, folks. He really did think that we could specify a unit of measurement. He called it the hedon. So 1 hedon or plus 1 hedon worth of pleasure is a positive number. Minus 1 hedon would be a unit of pain or unhappiness. And he formulated what he called a hedonistic or a hedonic calculus. Now, don't let the word calculus scare you. A calculus, in a more general sense, is a system within which we're able to make calculations. It's not necessarily the calculus by Newton and Laplace, the one where people have a textbook that thick. And all we're doing is adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this, and this is the last thing we're going to do today. But this is a simple illustration of utilitarian reasoning. And I got this from the old Encyclopedia of Philosophy. But it's held up over the years. And there's something to be said for a simple example. Often if somebody can see the point of something with a simple example, they can then go on and apply it to more complicated situations. So if you really understand at a good level how utilitarian reasoning works with a simple example like this, you can see how it works in a more complicated case, like whether or not you built a Bogdoon Dam, whether it's the morally right thing to do. Suppose you're an uncle and the circus is in town and you have a nephew. And one of your options for the weekend is that you could take your nephew to the circus. The other option that is probably what you would do if you don't do that is you would stay home and read a book that you like. Okay? So, to reason this out, what you're asking as a utilitarian is what side brings about, on balance, the most pleasure for all concerned. So taking your nephew to the circus. Well, now by the way, how do you get these numbers? Well, and your book, I think, goes into this in more detail than I need to. He had 7 marks, and I'm not going to discuss them all. But some of them are pretty obvious. In other words, if you're going to give numbers to pleasures and pain, certainly one thing you would take into account is the intensity of the pleasure and pain, right? And a more intense headache is less desirable than a less intense headache, right? So intensity would matter in deciding numbers. Also, how long is the pleasure or pain, right? In other words, duration. We have a multi-billion-dollar pain reliever industry in this country that is built around the premise that if you can take their pill and get rid of your headache in 20 minutes, where otherwise it might hang on for 3 hours, you're going to do it, and you're going to spend money to buy their pill. But also things like certainty and uncertainty. And where this comes into play, suppose you already have some gas in the tank, and you wanted to fill up the car, and you gave the attendant the 20, and you could only fit $19 in, right? Because he already had. So you have this dollar in change that's burning a hole in the pot. So one thing you could do is get a Hershey bar or a bag of chips, or you could play the lottery. Now, presumably, if you hit on the lottery, even if it were just for a 3-digit number, you'd have much more pleasure out of winning the lottery than you would just of eating a bag of chips or a candy bar. But you and I know that it's not very certain that you're going to win the lottery, even if it's only a 3-digit number, whereas there's a pretty much 100% certainty that you can enjoy the pleasure of that candy bar or bag of chips or whatever you buy. And so it seems like certainty would also come into play. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's by taking factors like that into account that Bentham thought we could assign numbers. So let's say boredom. Now, you say, well, boredom isn't pain, but it's an unpleasant feeling, which shows something about how Bentham is taking pleasure and pain here. It's in a very broad sense, right? More like pleasantness than unpleasantness. So boredom is an unpleasant feeling, right? So let's call that minus 5 hedons. Now, what's sympathetic pleasure? Well, ever get enjoyment at seeing a little brother or sister, or even your own child, open a birthday gift or a Christmas gift if you celebrate Christmas? You have pleasure seeing their happiness, right? And so this is what we call sympathetic pleasure. But then, so if his nephew enjoys the circus, he's going to get some pleasure out of seeing the nephew enjoy himself. But then there's the nephew's pleasure itself. Let's say he gets a lot of enjoyment out of it, plus 10 hedons. Well, you can do the math pretty easily, right? It's plus 10 plus 2 plus 12 minus 5, it's plus 7 hedons on this side. So that's what will be produced in terms of consequences for pleasure if you take this route. But suppose you read a book at home. Well, let's say you get some pleasure from reading the book, but not as much pleasure as your nephew would get from the circus. On the other hand, while you're sitting there enjoying the book, you're going to have some sympathetic pain knowing that you disappointed your nephew by not taking him to the circus. So let's call that minus 2 hedons. And then there's your nephew's disappointment itself. Say it's minus 8 hedons. So on this side, it's minus 4. Now, it's not always a plus-minus comparison. Sometimes it's a plus-plus, and you're looking for the greater plus. Sometimes it's a minus-minus that you're comparing. This is what happens in utilitarian euthanasia decisions. You're comparing the pain of 6 months with incurable cancer versus the pain of euthanasia. So what's the right thing to do for the uncle? Take the little tyke to the circus, right? Now, let me just point out one thing. One of the things that utilitarianism captures is that there are situations where for you and I to do the right thing may mean that we don't necessarily come out the best as a result of our decision. Because note, here, the side you don't choose, what comes to the uncle? Well, only plus 2 hedons worth of pleasure for himself, minus 5 hedons worth of pain of boredom. So it's minus 3 hedons for the uncle here. Here, the uncle gets plus 4 minus 2 hedons, or plus 4 hedons. So this is the choice where the uncle comes out best. But the uncle is not an egoist thinking only of himself. He's a utilitarian saying, well, what on balance promotes the greatest good for all concerned? And that turns out to be this choice. So that's how utilitarianism reasons. And just one more slide. Well, first of all, I often say, is it obvious to everyone how we got the numbers and that the numbers are what they are?
The bottom of it, yeah. I don't, it's not obvious how you get negative 5 and +2. That's made up.
I mean, no, these are objective numbers here.
That's
You know? There's no subjectivity involved here. No, you're right. I mean, that's a trick question, isn't it? I mean, the problem is what are pains and pleasures? They're subjective experiences. Also, hard to predict how somebody's going to like something. I mean, there was a time when Uncle Vic had to learn, as my nephews and niece grew up, that I need to get them a gift card for Christmas or something like that, that my, ability to guess what they would enjoy is very limited. So it's unrealistic to think that pleasures and pains can be compared in this exact way. One is that they're subjective, and also, yeah, you're right. How do you make the call? You can make it in a rough and ready way. We know that my headache today is worse than the one I had yesterday. But as far as assigning numbers, what do you need to know? Well, if you remember your physics, we had physics when I was in high school. Units like degrees Celsius, degrees Kelvin, what a meter is, these are all very meticulously defined, right? Before you know whether you have 2 or 12 or 20 of something, you need to know what it is to have one of that thing. And the problem is, as I say here, standardizing on a countable unit if your unit is something as elusive as measures of human pleasure and pain as hedons. So if you can't tell what's to count as one hedon, it's a non-starter, right? You can't get anywhere from there. So his original way of looking at this type of reasoning has some serious flaws. And again, we do make rough and ready comparisons. I can talk about my headache being worse today than yesterday. And medical people say, how's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? But it's still very subjective. So there are problems. Modern utilitarianism, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, and another way of looking at, say, the Bakum Dam situation is with a cost-benefit analysis, and I have a later slide that points this out, where you're balancing out economic costs versus economic benefits, and you're saying the morally right thing to do is make the choice that gives us the most bang for the buck, the most benefits versus costs for all concerned, And while we don't know what a hedon is, we do know what a dollar bill is, right? And so, a cost-benefit analysis is a more modern way of overcoming some of these drawbacks. Okay, well, Well, yeah. You are making right. I mean, I'm making these sacrifices now, but hopefully to give myself a better life in the future. You know, happier, more pleasurable life, or a life with more economic benefit than I would have. You know, but I'm sacrificing some now. I could be out making money, but I'm in college. But hopefully that's going to be balanced out. Yeah, it is a type of cost-benefit analysis. Okay, folks, thank you very much. And thank you for the papers.